research seminar for the MS students, presenting the progress report and the hopefully completion of the thesis by the end of the next
year. Thank you, Professor. Good morning, everyone, and good morning to everyone present in the Zoom and everyone present out here. It's my pleasure to present this first round of thesis presentation. So I would like to start with my presentation. So my thesis topic is intra-household allocation of household production in Nepal. What does this mean? So my thesis tries to examine the factors that may explain gender inequalities in the allocation of time to household production in Nepal. So let me start. So this is what my table of contents look like. So I'll first start with Nepal's socioeconomic context. Then I'll go explain how's the condition of gender disparity, and then what are the driving forces of inequality in Nepal, and then share some of the literature review findings, and also the determinants of hours of household production in Nepal, and then what's the condition of share of unpaid work in Nepal, and then I'll share some proposed methodology, and then finally I'll link this topic with the job guarantee. So this is my plan for the today's presentation. So I'll move ahead with the Nepal socio-economic context. So Nepal, just to give you a summary of where Nepal lies, is right between two big countries, India and China. It has population of around 30 million with a GDP per capita of USD 1,236. And there are most of the people are employed in the informal sectors, that is around 62.2%, and the subsistence agriculture characterizes the Nepal's labor market. If we look at the Nepal labor force participation rate, so male has higher percentage of labor force participation rate, which is 53.8% in comparison to 26.3% to female, and the unemployment currently in Nepal is around 11.4%, in which female has higher unemployment rate compared to male. So regarding this gender disparity, women spend at least 2 times as much as time doing unpaid labor as compared to males in almost all countries in the world. This is from the research finding by Parental and others in 2014. Also, men are far less interested in household activities. They not only appear to spend less hours of the time on domestic production, but also they appear to complete fewer household duties. So this is one of the research by one of our two or three of our professors who teach here at the Levy Institute. And then if we see the gender inequality in context of Nepal, it has gender index value of around 0.476, on which Nepal ranks 115th out of 162 countries in the world. This is according to Human Development Report 2019. So let us quickly, I want to say this slide because of one reason, because we need to understand how inequality, gender inequality has perpetuated in the Nepalese society, right? So after 1990s, Nepal followed this wave of privatization, mainly inspired from India and other South Asian countries. So Nepal also followed the menu of neoliberal policy. So how did it follow the menu of liberal policy? What it did was there was a massive deregulation in private investment, especially in education and health sectors. So as we all know, we created a two-tier system where rich pay for the private services and poor, they were forced to pay for the public services, and the public services has massively deteriorated, under which women and children, they are paying the highest price. Also, having studied public economics in at the college, I also realized that given imperfection and externalities, how market is not in a position to address the issues of poverty and inequalities. I think this is one of the striking findings and the realization that I found, and I think this is very relevant to Nepal's context as well. And so gender inequality also intersect with patriarchal norms and caste-based discrimination. As Nepal is a country of great cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity, so there are more than 100 castes. So it is like patriarchal norms and caste-based discrimination has mainly impacted women's and in terms of their economic empowerment, in terms of their women rights. That has really hampered them to rise above their and rise to their ability. Yeah. So next one is the reason why I want to focus access to education here is, if you look at the Nepal's geographical situation, right? Mainly mountain and hilly regions covers almost 80% of Nepal. That means investment in infrastructure is very, very difficult in that region. So most of the people, they live in rural areas and they don't have access to education, mainly because we hardly find schools in the hilly or in the Himalayan region. Because of that, the literacy rate is around 20% lower than among girls than boys. Also, girls are more likely to be put on to work or to be married of young age. If I have to give example of my own grandmother, she was married at the age of 10. Now you can imagine what was the situation like. And yeah, so because of that, especially women had to struggle a lot in their life, and it's very tough to when you get married at 10 and you are always bound by the patriarchal norms and you have to follow what your husband says, basically. So that has really a negative impact on women. Moving on, so men's and women's economic condition can be broadly categorized into three avenues. One is paid employment, which is included in system of national accounts and counted as labor force. Next is unpaid family work, which is part of the labor force and included in the national accounts, but they don't get any remuneration. And the main part of my thesis is this: unpaid, unrecognized, and unaccounted domestic work, which is neither marketed nor considered as economic activity, which is not counted in GDP, and they are not in the labor force at all. So I want to look at this part, how gender inequalities has improved or deteriorated based on the labor force survey of Nepal. So there are mainly, as per my literature review findings, there are mainly three theories around this area. One is time availability theory, second is resource-based theory, and third is gender ideology theory. What time availability theory tells us that partner who spends more time in paid employment will spend less time in household work. And resource-based theory tells us that the unequal distribution of power that may explain the distribution of unpaid care work. So it basically surrounds around the power that husband or wife has in the family. For example, if the husband has the greater power in terms of the financial capability, husband tend to rule the family because of this financial power. Also, there is one of the main criticism of resource-based theory, and that is in country like sub-Saharan area and Asia, there are extended family members and there are children which has been ignored by this theory. And yeah, this offers these children and other extended family members offers additional networks for supporting household while introducing more bargaining agents in the family. What gender ideology theory tells us is that the social norms and gender roles drive couples to display their proper roles in the household. What do I mean by proper roles? It means that breadwinner husband and homemaker wife. So looking after the set of factors that may affect the household allocation. So these are main factors that I've accounted in my research, that is role of age, role of education, time availability and employment status, children, household, how many household members are there, elders or any adults in the family, what's the caste, and what are the basic services available in the family, access to water, access to electricity, and what are the household facility consumed, and then who owns the land and house, and so on. I'll explain this part, especially when I discuss the methodology section, where I discuss about dependent and independent variable in detail. So let's look at what's the share of unpaid work in Nepal. Among the working age population, around 85% of women are engaged in unpaid work, whereas only 15% of men are engaged in unpaid work. When you look at the next graph, that the women or men who are not in who have not received any education, experience, or any kind of trainings, that means the male who have not received any experience, education, or trainings are around only 6%, whereas female is around 94%. So you can see the massive difference here in both graphs. So what are the main activities where there are unpaid production work? So these are the main activities according to the Nepal Labor Force Survey, which has been compiled by International Labour Organization. That is, they are mainly engaged in housework or home maintenance, looking after children, collecting firewood, fetching water, and care to adults, subsistence food production, and owing dwelling consumption. So moving on to the methodology section. For the methodology part, I have decided to use Nepal Labor Force Survey 2017-18. So I had to struggle a lot to get this data, and there was a kind of happy sad moment for me, because I was happy that I got the data, but at the same time, when I looked at the data and when I shared with the Tom Masterson, our professor, he said that yeah, people were asked to tell whatever activities they did in the last 30 months. So it's one of the terrible kind of time use data, but it's still maybe, and he gave me a green light that despite that, yeah, you can do an analysis of the data. So yeah, I feel very happy that at least this kind of work has been like very less people and professors have done this kind of work on household production in Nepal. So maybe I want to try it. Yeah, that's why thankfully I got the data and I can use it, and still challenge lies ahead of me, applying all those methodologies and coding and so forth. So what is my assumption for this research? Assumption is that time spent by each spouse is a function of personal and household characteristics. Also, bargaining power plays an important role in that. By bargaining power, I mean that who owns the land and who have better financial capability, who is the head of the household. Also, the one who is more educated tends to have more bargaining power in the family. So these are the factors and assumptions that I have taken into consideration. So, well, regarding the model estimation, I'm not quite sure if I can adopt this model. So I need to discuss with Fernando and Tom Masterson and all of my professors to yeah, figure out if my approach is correct or not. And I'll be happy to receive their suggestions, feedbacks, and yeah, based on this. So I've decided to use bivariate Tobit model to evaluate the impact of group of variables and determining the unequal distribution. So I'll have to frankly tell that I was inspired to go through one of the papers by Fernando Louisa, who is a research scholar here at Levy Institute, and Aduro. They wrote a paper similar on this topic in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe I thought that I could do similar in context of Nepal. So I was very inspired with that paper, and yeah, I would like to quote their paper in this model, which they have used and done a terrific job on that. And lastly, I'll calculate the marginal effect of a set of characteristics describing the households and its members. So regarding the dependent and independent variables, I'm going to analyze how the household and personal characteristics determine the allocation of time between husbands and wives in nuclear families. So my dependent variables will be how much time they spend on production of goods and production of services. By production of goods, I mean fetching water, collecting firewood, construction or repair works. Men tend to work mainly in construction or repair works, whereas women tend to spend more in fetching water and collecting firewood. In terms of production of services, cooking, cleaning are some of the household chores activities they are involved in, and there are also services such as child care. If there are elderly and disabled in the family, yeah, they are involved in these activities. In terms of independent variables, and we have individual characteristics like age, education, and caste. And by yeah, in the household characteristics, we have children, adults, and elders, household facilities consumed, and what are the household facilities they enjoy at home. Suppose what is the excess of electricity, lightning, gas, and so on. Also have accounted the ownership of land and employment status. So one of the limitation of my study would be that there are some data that are not available in the Nepal labor force survey, such as assets and liabilities, mainly liabilities where they don't ask question about what's their debt or how many loans they have taken from the banks or any small institutions. Also regarding the consumption, we have only like they have only included all the household facilities consumed, but they have not exactly recorded data and how many like how much they consume in terms of food and clothing. So that would be my limitation of the data. So yeah, since this is methodology section is under construction, I would be happy to yeah receive any comments or feedback. I would like to finally link my this thesis with the job guarantee program. I believe that state can play a vital role in pursuing federal level employment program, because the federal labor employment program such as job guarantee can have a large multiplier effects that generates direct and indirect employment in the economy, as ILO estimates that global employment in care jobs is expected to grow from 206 million to 358 million by 2030. And yeah, why do we need to come up with this job guarantee program in terms of care? Because we need to empower women and reduce the time limitation on women's labor. So I found this very good approach, 5R. Before there was 3R, triple R approach, which was reduce, recognize, and redistribute. Lately, there have been issues of like many economists have come up with 5R approach, that is recognize the work, reward their work, reduce their time limitation on labor work, and then redistribute and representation of the care work. Lastly, what Nepal could follow is something like investment in professional early childhood care services. There's one program carried out in India such as Anganwadi Center. By Anganwadi, it means that courtyard shelter. These centers provide medical care and nutritional service to newborns and their mothers in the community area. So this is the state welfare programs carried out in India. I think Nepal could follow the similar program, although we have Prime Minister Employment Program, but we have not extended to this kind of sector. So maybe it would be an opportunity for government to recognize and the care sector work. So for the way forward, my tentative plan is to complete methodology and coding in December and January. In February to March, do some analysis and come up with first draft. In April, finalize the thesis. And I would like to thank everyone for listening to my presentation, and I would appreciate questions, comments, and feedback. Thank you so much.
I saw that you had included the past variable.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what that variable is, how many groups are there, and what is your kind of expectation about why that would be important?
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your questions. As I mentioned in my presentation, caste discrimination is one of the main factor in terms of creating a gender inequality in the society, right? So if I look into the data, there are around more than 100 castes in Nepal. So, and there are data also has been collected collected in similar way as prescribed by the Nepal census 2011. So I think including this would be I would be missing the main component in terms of this would be the main missing link in terms of analyzing the gender inequality, especially in terms of household production, where many castes they force women to work at home and they don't allow women to give like more rights to women. So I think that would largely impact their bargaining power. Yeah.
It's very good presentation. So I question forward. Fine, you do implement the job guarantee program. How are you going to do this since there are all these cultural items? In other words, all right, the government assuming that sets up a job guarantee. But in India, it's not very considered. So how are you going to do this in Nepal? Women are accustomed to services that men don't believe that they are. Right? How are you going to do it? I mean, what kind of a job guarantee program? What EPA and they do? Have you thought about the kind of job, criteria, how go about?
Thank you so much for your question. That's very relevant and to the point. My first initial plan was to write thesis on job guarantee program, right? But as I digged into it, I thought that would not be possible, mainly in terms because of data. In terms of my main focus will not be job guarantee, right? I'll just try to link how just from the superficial level how job guarantee can help in this process. So that will not be my main process. So I'll not be explaining that in detail. I'll just recommend some of the policies such as that is been practical and that is very suitable for Nepal, especially following the example of India. But yeah, I have not like frankly speaking, I have not fully come up with a model how I can implement this job guarantee program. One way I think would be possible is to integrate with the Prime Minister Employment Program, which we already have been running since 2 or 3 years. So maybe I think that would be the best sort to include this kind of employment in the economy.
You know, in job grants, people are measured up to benefit. So there are a lot of things that we can do.
Yeah.
Therefore, take a look at some of our.
Yeah, I think to be fair, we should add that as the evolution proposal has gone on, the idea of actually formulating the job guarantee has gone from the beginning to the end, and you notice that this is the thing which appears at the end. It is not very clearly formulated at this stage, and it's really not clear to what extent this will propose a major role of the it's basically a calculation. The impact factor.
Yes.
Whether it's the end, but we're still formulating job guarantee aside from saying that this is a possible way of ameliorating problems. That's the limit. Okay, now ready to move to the next.
I think Martha had a question.
No, I was going to say exactly that. I mean,
Okay.
I don't program for Nepal will take you a whole other because as you point out, you have to look at the cultural already in place. And
Yeah.
also one way to not deviate, but to somehow adjust for the cultural differences and whatever patriarchal issues there are. And this is how it was told in Argentina, was to involve the community in the projects that they wanted to participate in. So that actually, by including the participants of those programs, they're actually ensuring that their cultures are not disgraced or messed up by including people in what they want to do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that would be really helpful, and yeah, I'll look into all those papers. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. So my presentation, my thesis is going to be on wealth taxation and its effect and incorporation into the Levy Institute measure of economic well-being. So my presentation is going to have 4 parts. So I'll have a short discussion of my research questions, my guiding research questions, a very brief discussion of the LEMU. I think for everybody who hasn't been in either Tom's classes or public econ won't have any experience with LEMU. And then a short discussion of what type of wealth taxation I'm going to look at. And then one primary methodological consideration that I'm trying to deal with right now. So my 3 guiding questions are what impact would a wealth tax have on LEMU inequality? How does this impact vary between different wealth tax constructions? Different, you can have different tax bases, you can have different brackets and or what's called tax schedules, and these lead to different tax incidences. And then how would different uses, this is kind of like a step 2, how would different uses or distributions of revenue from the wealth tax impact Levy inequality? So you'd have a impact on inequality from the actual act of taxation, then you'd have an impact from the distribution of the tax. And inequality can of course be looked at from both like a general population level, like just general Gini coefficient for the entire population, or you can have measures of between group inequality. Compare, for instance, wealth is very unevenly distributed across racial lines, particularly between white people and Black and Hispanic people. So I'm just going to do a brief overview of LEMU by using a diagram provided in one of the working papers, or one of the published working papers, comparing it to the Census Bureau's extended income measure. So both of them start with money income, and then they both remove from this property income and government cash transfers. And then both add back in, or add in-kind compensation from employer contributed health plans, or in-kind compensation from work, such as employer contributions for health insurance. And this end result is base income. And the starting point money income is generally the most widely used measure of economic well-being. And then you both have income from wealth incorporated into it, but whereas extended income incorporates only flows such as property income, they incorporate flows such as property income and realized capital gains, and then one stock, imputed return on home equity. The LEMU incorporates total wealth, or net wealth, and that's divided into an annuity from non-home wealth and imputed rent on owner-occupied housing. And we'll come back to this because this is the. And then from these, both take away taxes. LEMU also takes away consumption taxes, whereas EI does not. And then you add in cash transfers, so by the government, and non-cash transfers, so by the government, and non-cash transfers, so yeah, for both of them, and then that is the end of extended income. But then for LEMU, you add in 2 more things. The first is public consumption, so things provided by the government that are not commodities, not traded on the market. So for instance, public education is the major component of public consumption. And then also household production. So the services and goods produced inside the household that are not exchanged. And that will give you LEMU. So you can see that LEMU is a much more expansive measure than extended income, which actually the Census Bureau doesn't really use anymore, unfortunately. They basically just stick with money income, so which is even less expensive measure. And LEMU can be thought of more simply as the sum of 4 components: base income, income from wealth, net government expenditures, and household production. So then the second question for LEMU: how does wealth figure into LEMU, and how would a wealth tax figure into LEMU? So we touched on income from wealth. So non-home wealth has 5 components. I can read them out, but it's basically everything except owner-occupied housing. And this is using historical rates of return from each of these components. You calculate an annuity, and the annuity is assumed to pay out over the course of the household head, or the partner of the household head, if there's one, whichever of their lifespans is higher. So it's assumed that at the end of that lifespan, the annuity is equal to 0. So they're going to have an annual consumption based on the composition of their annuity and the rates of return on the various assets in that annuity. And life expectancy is estimated by age, sex, race, ethnicity. So the wealth tax obviously come out of taxes, and for redistribution, it would come into cash transfers. So one possible or use of wealth tax revenue be something like reparations for slavery, for instance. So another important question for the kind of the foundation of my thesis is how significant is wealth to LEMU levels and to LEMU inequality? So this is from a recent working paper, and you have the composition of LEMU in the year 2000 and the year 2013, broken down into those four major components we discussed. And as you can see, base income, like earnings, is the largest component, but income from wealth is a significant second, with about 24% of the total composition of LEMU. And then we can look a little closer at the evolution of income from wealth as a component of LEMU over time. So this is the LEMU distribution broken down into quintiles, and then each line represents the average household, so the mean value of the households in each quintile. So the big blue line on top that grabs your attention is the top 20% of households, well, the average household in the top 20% of households. And you see from 1959 to 2013, there's been a significant increase in absolute inflation-adjusted income from wealth as a component of LEMU. There's the next most well-off quintile also has a significant increase, I think about double between 1959 and 2013, but it's obviously starting from a much lower point. And then when you get down to the bottom two quintiles, there is not any increase, and you'll see in the next slide there's in another respect a decrease. But this breakdown obviously also masks some important inequalities, particularly in race. So if you look at the gray line, that is the middle quintile. And if you were to break this down into, say, a distribution of white households and a distribution of black households, or black household heads, white household heads, you would have a black average middle quintile value of about a third that of the white average middle quintile value. And similar results for the breakdown with Hispanics compared to Hispanic household heads compared to white. And this is another way to look at the distribution over time, or the significance of wealth over time. So here, instead of having absolute values, you have the income from wealth as a percent share of total LEMU by quintile. So you see for the top quintile, income from wealth has become much more significant, going from just about 17% in 1959 to nearly 40% in 2013. So, there's been a actual decrease in, you can see in the first quintile, going from about 11% to just over 7%, I think, in 2013. So, and then I'm looking at three models of wealth taxation. So two of them, the Warren and Sanders model, were introduced in the 2020 Democratic primary. And then the Swiss model is based on an adaptation by Edward Wolff, and he's written quite a bit on wealth taxation. And he also has co-published with authors here at Levy, but he hasn't done anything on relating LEMU and wealth taxation. So at the federal level, wealth is taxed in two ways in the US right now. That's estate taxes and realized capital gains taxes. But at the sub-federal level, property taxes also function as a tax on wealth. But yeah, and so these are the three models adopted from various writings. You can see that the tax base is very similar for all of them, net worth, and then the Swiss model excludes vehicles. which in the main source of data, the survey of consumer finances, vehicles are included in net wealth, so that would be a methodological issue to work with. So the tax incidence is the percent of households that would pay into the tax as the wealth distribution exists right now. And the tax incidence is determined by the various, or determined by the tax schedule. So you can see that the Warren model is the simplest. Between 50 million and 1 billion net worth, people would pay 2%, and then above 1 billion, 3%. And then the Sanders model drops the threshold down to 32 million for couples, half that for singles, and then has a much more gradated increase and applies to more households because the lower threshold. The Swiss model is the most broad-based and is the one that Wolf has proposed, and that would bring into question some issues about what's called the liquidity problem, about households having adequate income stream to pay their burden in wealth tax. And in fact, in Switzerland, if I'm recalling correctly, it might have been a different OECD country. I don't have that note in front of me. But I think they have this explicit clause where you can't have a higher burden than income stream. So yeah, and then the one methodology problem I wanted to discuss is that so Levy has employed a consistent set of data sources since 1982, with the ASEC serving as the base to which the other sources are matched. For wealth, the survey of consumer finances is used. And the survey of consumer finances includes a high income supplement, which actually makes it a fairly good representation of the wealth distribution. But both the analysis I've seen of the Sanders and Warren plan, as well as Wolf's Swiss proposal, incorporate the Forbes 400 list because they're systematically excluded from the survey of consumer finances. So especially when you have a small tax base, such as in the Warren plan, most extreme, but also the Sanders plan is relatively small. It would be very beneficial to have the Forbes 400 data incorporated, and I'm not sure exactly, how that will play with the statistical massing process used in Levy. Yeah, that's my presentation.
Okay, thank you. Questions from all of you? Very high level. Everybody has an idea?
Oh, Professor?
I'm not concerned about the network, but what about the information on I don't know where you plan to go with this. I mean, if you're actually going to use the database to simulate the effects of this different tax proposal, then I don't think that we can get very far without the folks for it. So you may want to look at it as a couple of papers, which when we have tried to bring in the folks 400 to the ACF. So then there's a problem of rating. Not what is the survey get population representation.
Yeah.
But that may be something that you may want to consider if you do want to simulate.
Yeah.
Right. Is that what you plan to do?
Yeah. There's the one idea of doing a type of comparative static analysis where I could ask, what level of wealth taxation would require or would lead to a reduction in Levy by a particular amount, or but especially if I want to do, because the wealth tax would be annual, all these models are annual, that would require a type of simulation, and yeah, that's what I was hoping to do.
So, you mentioned about the possibility of redistributing this money.
I think that's mostly a secondary concern for the simulation stuff is the primary thing that I've been thinking about. But I mean, like I mentioned, reparations was one thing, but yeah, apart from reparations, that wasn't really enough.
Okay, great.
No, forget it.
Okay.
That's
What's the question?
okay.
Oh, who can you decide?
Oh, I forgot to share the screen. Oh, I thought it said you were. Sorry about that.
Student that goes, there's a free,
I don't know, I think maybe you have to stop the share and then start a new one because yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. Why not? Okay, is the screen shared now?
Okay.
Okay. Good, yeah. Thanks all for coming. Very happy to present on things which I've learned over the last 1.5 years, actually. Yeah. So the topic will be to develop a stock flow consistent model of income inequality, and I specifically focus on the effects of the German labor market reforms on the European Monetary Union. And I take this as an example how income inequality in Germany affects aggregate demand and thereby production and output, not only in Germany, but also in countries that trade with Germany. Yeah, quick introduction. In the 1990s, Germany was considered the sick man of Europe, with current account deficits and budget deficits, Germany was the first country which violated the Maastricht criteria, which Germany is now very eager to impose on other countries. In the 2000s, however, Germany turned into an export powerhouse. So a lot of economic commentators would describe the German labor market reforms as an unpopular success story. Unpopular because, as I will show you in a bit, the German labor market got heavily deregulated, and a lot of people in Germany, even within the party who was responsible for the labor market reforms, would not talk about this reform in a very positive way publicly. Right? So, but economists would say, okay, the people have not really understood the benefits, and therefore it's an unpopular success story. Hold on. How can I remove this? Important. Whatever. Okay. Theoretical background. The entire nexus of income distribution and macroeconomic outcomes is well rooted in the post-Keynesian tradition, as we have been taught here at Levy. So from this approach, or from this perspective, we treat the distribution of income not as an outcome, as in the neoclassical tradition, where it reflects marginal productivity of factors, but we treat it as a crucial determinant for macroeconomic outcomes, for growth, for employment, for inflation, and so on. This is based on the very old observation, which also gets confirmed empirically from time to time, is that higher income earners have a higher savings rate. And this is why income inequality reduces aggregate demand and spending and output.
So if we have income inequality, countries can achieve growth either by increasing investment, by increasing the government deficits, by higher domestic debt, or by net exports, or obviously a combination of all those factors. However, investment has slowed down in nearly all advanced capitalist countries for different reasons. There's new Keynesian, post-Keynesian Marxist explanation for this, which I will not focus now on in the presentation. An increase in government debt is limited due to austerity ideology, which then transform into fiscal rules such as the Maastricht criteria or debt ceilings in the US. One very interesting paper is obviously the Reinhard Rogan Growth in a Time of Debt post-financial crisis paper, where they argued that debt to GDP levels above 9% are very bad for growth and employment. And yeah, the UMass grad student Herndon wrote a nice replication of this, identifying all these sorts of errors they had in their sample and also in their methodology. But it's still real. So that's the thing, like they can even prove it, but it's still real. We still have all those rules and they still constrain fiscal policy. So there's a lot of authors, which I will focus on, who argue that growth over the past decades has been driven by a combination of the last two factors. So domestic debt and also an increase in net exports, which stabilize aggregate demand. Yeah. Then there's a very good paper by Michalis, who said in his non-behavioral theory of saving that if we have income inequality, the only way to achieve full employment is by increasing leverage of the lower part of the income distribution. I think he talks about lower 80 or 90%, which have to go into debt in order to stabilize aggregate demand, in order to achieve full employment in the presence of income inequality. And in this thesis, I will take the wage moderation in Germany and the labor market reforms as an example on how the reduction in aggregate demand due to income inequality gets compensated by an increase in net exports, and how this is related to the creation of the European Union and the euro itself. So this friendly man is Gerhard Schröder, who started as a Marxist and then gave a remarkable speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And he was the chancellor in the early 2000s in Germany and was mainly responsible, or his government was mainly responsible for the labor market reforms, which then became popular under the slogan the Hartz reform. And yeah, he was proud in Davos and gave this remarkable speech in 2005 where he said, "We have created one of the best low-wage sectors in Europe. For years, the unit wage costs have been stagnating, a good development for investments in this country." Or we would also call him the German variant of third-way social democracy. So, even prior to the Hartz reforms, the German labor market was characterized by agreements between employers, unions, and work councils on keeping wages low. There's, for instance, the four-time agreement of 2004 between workers of the metal and chemical industry, which made a deliberate agreement with their employers to keep wages low in exchange for job security. So the companies would threat their workers to relocate to the former countries of the Soviet bloc. But they made this agreement to keep wages low in exchange for job security. Then there were the Hartz reforms, which got introduced over the period from 2003 to 2005, and the last package became effective in January 2005. It meant a reduction in unemployment benefits and a reduction in employment protection, deregulation of temporary employment, and recreation or a change in the agency for work. And for instance, people who were unemployed now had to go to the agency for work. They got a case worker who got a premium when they found, or when he was able to place them into a labor market employment, wage employment. And for this, it did not matter at all if the person was satisfied or if the contract of the job offer was for a 10-year contract or whatever. So they got a premium and this also incentivized to put them in very precarious situations because they knew in 3 months they might be back, and then I can place them into a new precarious job and I get a new premium and so on. Yeah, studies have found that the HALS reforms decreased the unemployment rate, the non-cyclical component of it, by 2.9 percentage points. And another study says that the HALS reforms explain 20% of the post-reform unemployment decline in Germany. So this graph shows the development of the unemployment rate, the blue line, and the net exports of Germany, the black line. And I have 2 dashed red lines. One is, the first one is the introduction of the euro, which is very important for the net exports, because the euro was valued lower than the Deutschmark, and this made Germany a lot more competitive, or German exports more competitive. And the second dashed line shows the introduction of the labor market reforms, and we can quite clearly see how unemployment declines afterwards. And there's some ambiguity on the direct effects of the HALS reforms, of the strength of it. Most authors would also emphasize the sort of deliberate wage moderation in the early 2000s, but it definitely had an effect, which shows also up in this graph. So now there's 2 interpretations of what was going on. The first one has a right-wing and a left-wing perspective on the issue. It's generally that Germany's wage moderation outcompeted production in peripheral Europe. And the left perspective would be, oh, then German wages need to rise. And the right-wing perspective would be, no, peripheral wages need to decrease. But it's still within the same framework that they would compete, that there would be price competition between Germany and peripheral European Monetary Union countries. The second perspective calls the first one the labor cost competitiveness myth. And they argue that changes in unit labor cost in Germany and in many other countries generally only explain a very small fraction of the export prices, and that there is predominantly non-price competition. And they all emphasize the importance of the China shock, that German export products fitted very well into the development strategy of China, while China directly competed on a price competition basis with the production in peripheral Europe. And due to this nexus, that they face a very different export demand elasticity. So Germany, over a long period, many authors describe them as nearly price-setting behavior with high-tech export goods, while the demand elasticity for exports from peripheral economies, that they were very elastic. And this led to export-led and debt-led growth regimes within the European monetary. As I said, I tried to develop an SFC model with Gennaro to show that how German wage moderation is connected to the outcomes in other European Monetary Union countries. Because in the current discussion, this is often overlooked. Like, we have a new finance minister from the Liberal Party, who actually gave a very terrifying speech a few days ago and said we should implement the same reforms we have forced upon Greece to reform the German labor market. And he said this should be a great role model for the entire European Union. And I was quite shocked by it, because it's a very stupid, very, very stupid and very dangerous analysis of what was going on. And I hope that SFC models generally can show the interconnectedness of several agents and how policy in one country influences the outcome in another. So yeah, I think it's mostly based on the model of Godley and Lavoie, 2007. They analyze 3 economies with 2 currencies. So they have the Eurozone with 2 regions, and they have the US. I will change this in a little bit. And there's 2 more recent papers which also deal with this issue, and they expand and make it a bit more complicated. So there's one which focuses on income distribution, how this affects current account imbalances. And there's also one which shows how if you start from an initial difference in technological capabilities, this leads to debtor-creditors relationships, which are path-dependent and lead to divergence within the European Monetary Union. So in the model I'm currently working on, we have a core periphery pattern within the European Monetary Union. I stick to this because this pattern seems to persist empirically. So it has three regions: core, periphery, and rest of the world. I will focus on China as rest of the world due to the effect on the trade imbalances between the core and the periphery, and how the China shock affected them differently. There will be cost plus markup pricing, as in one model by Dos Santos and Cesar, but there will be a different power to increase the markup in the core and the periphery, which should reflect the non-price competition for the core, which has a higher power to set prices, but also the price competition between the periphery and rest of the world, or China. So the periphery has a lower, the companies and the firms in the periphery have a lower power to increase the markup on their products. Also, core and periphery face different bargaining power over wages, which leads to different inflation rates. And then we have all those things are like the general structure of the model, and then the wage moderation will be like a shock in one period. So one very important channel is also the internationalization of banks in the core, mainly French and German banks, who, due to the removal of currency risk with the introduction of the euro, were quite eager to increase lending to the periphery, thereby propping up aggregate demand there, reducing unemployment and increasing wages, which also transferred into a higher inflation rate in the peripheral countries, which made the export goods also less competitive vis-a-vis China. Also, one feature will be that the core and the periphery share a central bank which applies a Taylor rule on their interest rate, which is, however, biased to the core, because this is also something which comes up in a lot of studies, that the interest rate set by the central bank in the early 2000s was maybe appropriate for stagnant Germany, but not for the periphery of the EMU. And then to incorporate this path dependency, I will have endogenous productivity growth depending on the markup. So Germany can increase its markup and thereby invest more and thereby have a higher productivity growth, and this leads to divergence as a long-term phenomenon. So how do those trade imbalances show up in the model? First of all, the demand of the core for export goods from periphery decreases due to wage moderation and inequality in Germany, which has a depressionary effect on the periphery. Then the exports of the periphery also decrease due to competition from China. So the export goods from the periphery have a higher price due to the common currency and the therefore higher exchange rate than the exchange rate might have been in their old currencies. Also, in this also factors in the different wage bargain in the periphery, but also the capital inflows from the core, which then increase wages and inflation in the periphery, which makes their goods less competitive, which also overall has a depressionary effect. And then we have the different export elasticities. This is mainly valid for the core, where mainly Germany, I've only been focusing on Germany right now, but I want to expand this a little bit more, have very high price setting power, allow for different markups, and thereby this has a stimulating effect on the core, which also increases their productivity. Next steps, I want to better understand existing models, see where I can connect, what I want to change of them, and hopefully develop the transaction flow matrix of the model to have a good overview and a good structure. I want to discuss with General, but also with some authors who did those. I already reached out to them who did those models I've been talking about 5 minutes ago. Yeah, coding the main structure in January, finish up, do some econometric calibrations for some parameters in February, March, write the thesis in April, and pray to God. Yeah, thanks so much. Any comments? Highly appreciate it.
So I have to understand that you haven't made it.
Mhm.
It is a very literature review, but you find some difficulties in setting the model.
Yeah, I mean, I've done some quite in-depth reading of two models which are very close to mine, and I didn't feel able to present on them now. And I discussed the ideas with Gennaro, and Gennaro said it should be all right. This is all what I can say right now. But yeah, I hope to do so in January.
So I included the labor market.
Mhm.
Maybe you show it the way.
Yeah, can you recommend me some attempts you've been doing or some difficulties that came up?
Okay.
Right. I mean, we had this benchmark model with Dos Santos from 2008, which had a labor market and the cost plus markup approach, which then leads to output prices. And the idea was to use this and have different parameters in the wage bargaining equation for the core and for the periphery, which then translates into different output prices and then into trade imbalances. That was the way to go. Okay.
Great.
Okay, thank you, sir.
All right, thanks.
So right now we are not sharing, right? See? Okay. Okay. So 1, 2. Okay. Oh no. Okay. And then I still have to share, right? Yes, yes. Okay. Okay. Well, this is gracias. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making space to come here, and also welcome everyone who is online. I want to take a minute to read a very short passage of a book that I was recommended by Marta, actually a few years ago, which I think summarizes very well my political views around Latin America. and this is somehow carry on my thesis. So I will I will read 1 minute something. For the world today, America is just the United States. The region we inhabit is a sub-America, a second-class America of a nebulous identity. Latin America is the region of open veins. Everything from its discovery until our times has been transmuted into European or later United States capital and has accumulated in distant centers of power. Everything, the soil, its fruits, and its mineral-rich depths, the people and their capacity to consume and to work, natural resources and human resources. Production methods and class structure have been successively determined from outside, always for the benefit, Production methods and class structure have been successively determined from the outside for each area by meshing it into the universal gearbox of capitalism. To each area has been assigned a function, always for the benefit of the foreign metropolis of the moment, and the endless chain of dependency has been endlessly extended. So this is the situation of Latin America. There is dependency, there is no sovereignty, and this is my concern, my main concern at this moment. And my attempt in my thesis is how, which mechanisms could bring dependence and sovereignty to the region that hasn't happened since colonial times. So my topic is around, I talk for an alternative federal currency. I think this could be a mechanism to expand sovereignty for countries with foreign debt, specifically Latin America. And I forgot to say my name. My name is Angelica Huerta Ojeda, and I'm from Mexico. So my argument is that an alternative currency, issued and controlled by the state, by the federal government, could make some Latin American countries less dependent and more sovereign. I don't know what happened there with my arrows, but I apologize. But the idea, I am underlining dependency and sovereignty because I think there's an inverse relationship between them. To more dependency leads to less sovereignty. Less sovereignty leads to more dependency, or more sovereignty will help to be less dependent, and less dependent to have more sovereignty. And by dependency, I mean dependency of food, dependency of technology, dependency of energy. Usually developed Latin American countries are high importers of these sectors, food, technology, and energy, which makes us not be monetary sovereign, not have control of our currency, peg our currency by high interest rates. So I explored the relationship behind the dependency, why the region is dependent and not sovereign. And I go back to historical debt. I think that a good amount of the reasons of the current dependency of the region is because of, in colonial times, there were credit debt relationships created by the imposition of taxes and the use of force. And these relationships change once the region gained independence from Spain. But the only condition for the region to be independent from Spain was if, if we had to be recognized by another important country, and this was Britain. And the conditions that Britain imposed for the region to be recognized as independent was acquiring debt from the British and have free trade with them, which made the region have new dependencies. But these, the debt of the region has changed since then. So I have to expand how that has changed during, when Britain was the predominant country in the world from 1821 to 1930, and then there was a change of order from 1930 to 1945 after World War I and World War II, and the Great Recession. I forgot the name. The Great Recession, right? Yeah. And then how, after the World War II, United States made a predominant country of power, and the trade dynamics and debt dynamics also changed since then. So I will explore how debt and dependency has changed for the region since then. And then we have this cartoon, and I think there are two main reasons behind the debt trap. I think the region now is in a debt trap because the region, for some reason or another, has already acquired debt or has been imposed to it, and now we are told by international institutions like the World Bank or the IMF or the OCDE some helpful measures, quote unquote, for the repayment of the debt, which actually makes us more sick. So let's have this drawing first, this cartoon. This is the world, but let's just focus on Latin America. And then the IMF says maybe bloodletting isn't enough. Should we also apply leeches? And the OCDE says, why isn't the patient getting any better? So bloodletting or bloodletting, I don't know how to pronounce it, is the process of removing blood from the agent and then putting it back. So it's an extractive and invasive procedure. It's an invasive procedure. And we are told that to treat the problems of the region of debt, we have to make structural policies to attract foreign direct investment and repay the debts, or be a net exporter. And what are those structural policies? This is precarization, what do you say? Precarization, thank you, of the labor market, selling strategic resources, and well, then the OCDE says, like, why isn't it getting better? And the IMF says, should we also apply leeches? And leeches is this parasite here, and Michael Hudson, in the context of debt, but of different kind of debt in Wall Street, has this analogy that leeches are like debt, as I understand, in the sense that the patient, whenever it gets a leech, first the leech numbs the patient, then the leech produces another enzyme that makes the agent believe you need the leech for your survival and for your existence. So is the idea that Latin America has come to believe that we need more debt to continue existing, and that's the it's inherent for the nature. But we can actually see that the patient is sick, and extractive procedures have continuing the region, and well, the United States or the Britain before would be accumulating and would be developing. So then I asked myself, okay, what can we done with the foreign debt? And I so far have explored just two different views, Keynes and ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a very predominant institution in Latin America for the construction of policies and the way we construct policies. So very briefly, Keynes has this book of The Economic Consequences of Peace, where he says, okay, let's pardon the debt. And I will read this quote: if the greatest lender of money does not need the money back, they should simply cancel the debt. There's another one that says, the continuance of a huge scale of indebtedness between government has a spatial dangers of its own. And later in 1941 has the Clearing Union proposal, where Keynes proposes this on the lines of cooperation, settling international indebtedness better and more honestly, and maintaining exchange controls. And the ECLAC has a similar policy in this, well, okay, like the Clearing Union, promoting as the optimal solution multilateral agreements, and a second best solution bilateral agreements between the debtor and the creditor, and then other actions which they are not promoted as favorable or desirable are unequal unilateral agreements. And here I have a Venn diagram which shows where they graphically their positions, and I say that why would we believe that that creditors who have benefited from this creditor-debtor dynamics would out of nowhere just cancel the debt? that won't happen. So I think that a unilateral solution is the only viable solution that Latin American countries could do to get out of these dynamics, this unequal power dynamics. So I think that we could use the same properties of money that we're using in the beginning to create unequal power dynamics, but in our favor of to change the credit debt relations. And this is a quote of Keynes on Treatise on Money, that it's in Treatise on Money, that somehow appeals for creating a new currency or re-edit the dictionary. So I will just read it. It says, state created the currency and it has the right to re-edit the dictionary by varying its declaration of what thing corresponds to the name from time to time. So the government created the currency. The currency is a creature of the government, and the government could change or could create a new currency if that's what benefits the public purpose, which I hope every government does. So my proposal is that at the federal level, the government creates an alternative currency, because this would be a fiscal policy mechanism to increase liquidity and finance government expenditure, and to increase national production and avoid price pressure and imports. This currency should not be convertible to any other, at least done by the government, to prevent capital outflows, and should only be accepted to buy national produces with a high national content or full national content as a way to avoid capital outflows and stimulate national consumption. In the worst scenario, the government, a government that is not sovereign in food or energy or technology, would become sovereign in food production. That would be the worst scenario, to become sovereign in food production, as Mexico had before NAFTA. Now we import, I think, 48% of the food that we consume. So in the worst scenario, we would become food sovereign. And in the worst scenario, the countries could, or some countries that have the real resources and the size and the capacity, could get other kinds of, maybe they could develop technology or start reducing dependencies other than food. That would be the best scenario. And I know it's important, the resources and the size and the capacity. I think capacity can be built by the current institutions, universities, centers of research, increasing expenditure on this is very important. And I think the alternative currency could, with other measurements, could help this procedure. but this is what I have so far. And I welcome any kinds of comments, critiques, observations. Thank you so much. Marta, yes.
I like this, and I just wanted to mention that this is something that already President Duran has proposed in 2007, about the backward tool, and it was, in my opinion, one of the excellent ideas that never came up but it was great because it was going to be a partnership with Latin America. Sadly, Mexico was not included. It was South America, but remember when we had Lula, President Kirchner, everybody was pushing it forward, but it never came to light. There's there has always been this competition among Latin America, but it never came to light. But I suggest that you read try and find it. I think there are some people that have written about it, but I think if you go to that page, everyone, talking about them and have a whole material that we can probably read just as a, as a political side.
Thank you, Marta.
Take your place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take your place.
Yes, Dimitri.
So you basically talked about the biology. Because you're not in freedom. It's not convertible.
Right.
There is a currency that is convertible.
Right. Yes.
There was the power. So I think we should take a look at how the Levy paper talked about.
Right.
And there is a currency that called supplementary still work. Limited. The body represents about 5-7%. But it's more or less exactly like the way we describe, but for these accounts, using more than
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
central bank.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Julius.
I know that it has the tendency to go particular to the US, and these are very much topic. And I think that one of the initiatives Chavez did here was also the Sucre, that it was currently instead of this government, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Bolivia. And I think that Esteban Perez from Latin America, and not particularly this country, but he has very little bit of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, Esteban shared with me some readings about the Sucre, but I thought it was to as a mean of payment to clear trade unbalances only. So it, yeah, I guess would be different, but still important to acknowledge. Thank you.
Now, the one proposed by President Duran was to do that. And the idea was to create this bank that will totally replace the IMF and all the other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, Ben.
You see the debt as the primary determinant, or you see the debt as because I would see the debt as a function of the social relation of power. Or it's the net relation of power, economic development that put the imperialism tradition, they impose the collection of debt.
I think.
And they're interconnected.
Yeah, I agree they are interconnected, but I think that in the context of Latin America, that was that was acquired first to pay for war and to buy materials from the British to fight against this Spain. So there was that initial debt, and then it was exacerbated by the imposition of free trade. So I don't know if that responds to your question, but I think yet debt and its maintenance, it's a result of unequal power dynamics, which at the same time that reproduces and enhances or maintains the unequal power dynamics. So it's, yeah, kind of mutually related, or I don't know how to explain it. They're both feeding each other. Do you want to follow up, or?
No, I mean, you answered.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Want to take a break? Go ahead, we'll take the break.
How much are those? The one?
15 minutes.
Okay, so blue is 15? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, we can only go.
Just the message I asked. Sorry. Does anyone know how to like get rid of F5?
Or you clear the chat notifications.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. Okay, and then Martha, is it? I'm assuming it's probably showing, right? We're good? Okay, so my thesis is called the Community Reinvestment Act, Reimagined. And then first, what is the Community Reinvestment Act? The Community Reinvestment Act, enacted in 1972, requires the Federal Reserve and other federal banking regulators to encourage financial institutions to help meet the credit needs of the communities in which they serve, including low and moderate income neighborhoods, which will just going to be LMI neighborhoods. So an introduction, or my brief overview of the thesis is an introduction, which will include background information on the CRA and redlining. Chapter 1 should be the strength of the CRA. Chapter 2 will be the weaknesses of the CRA, and then Chapter 3 will be conclusion on the effectiveness of the CRA, and then policy recommendations to combat the aforementioned shortcomings. Is it now show? We're good? Okay. Still good? Okay.
So for my introduction, I want to start off with a brief historical context of the time when the law was written. This will include a discussion on redlining, prejudice banking practices, and how this affected the racial wealth gap. I then want to move on to discussion on banks' relationships with communities in terms of deposit sources versus loan originations and the impact that has on development. Prior to the enacting of the CRA, banks had a limited obligation to serve the communities in which they took deposits. This resulted in disinvestment, which is when banks take deposits from areas without providing subsequent loans. And as we know, loans create deposits. So without loan production, these areas were forgotten about and suffered greatly. I then want to move on to the larger effect that CRA served and to speak about the other bills passed to make the United States financial system more equal. Those were the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1974 and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Another part of my introduction is going to be how has the CRA changed over time, including like what are the effects / rationale for these changes. And then I want to go into a description of the CRA exams. There are 3 tests that the CRA takes into account, which are the lending test, the investment test, and the service test. I want to go into how like each one of these activities would affect local communities and their economies. And I want to go into the point assignment for each test, with lending being the most highly weighted, and a composite rating point requirement. For chapter 1, I want to first establish that the CRA has indeed had an effect on lending. To do so, I will use several data analytics papers that observe lending activity in areas that recently gained and lost CRA eligibility. After discussing the general ability of the CRA to alter lending behavior, I want to go into specifics on what degree small business lending and mortgage lending have seen changes. This will be primarily done using data analytics papers that delve into these changes, that delve into changes in these types of lending due to the CRA. Once CRA lending has been discussed, I want to highlight the effects. I want to show the aggregate effects of the bill as a whole, with a discussion on credit extension and poverty alleviation. Some of the papers I've been looking at so far talk about just general numbers of people being brought above the poverty line due to the CRA, and also the effect that this has had on certain policies like food stamps and how people have been able to get off of food stamps, and they attribute it to the CRA. I also want to then discuss the effect the CRA has had on banks. Specifically, I'll probably focus on profitability and bank branch closures. I then want to discuss the economic importance of small business and mortgage lending, seeing as these are the 2 kind of main points of lending in the CRA. Small business lending is vital in building up communities. I then want to back this up with statistics. And then buying a home is one of the quickest ways to build wealth in the United States. And I want to then show the relation between home ownership and wealth. Within the context of income inequality, I want to finish this chapter with a discussion on why the ultimate goals of the CRA have an important impact on the United States economy. This could include speaking about the potential output loss due to financial inequality. I think Simon's paper mentioned a little bit what kind of like inequality could potentially do to economy, like on a large scale. I want to talk about that a little bit. Before beginning my section on the shortfalls of the bill, I wanted to begin with the most recent data on income inequality, credit inequality, and low middle income investment areas. There's still much work needed to be done, even though this bill has been in effect for over 40 years. I'll then go into my specific critiques of it, which are not finished yet, but these are kind of what I've been thinking of so far. The first one being performance evaluation failures. The data used to score these banks is often incomplete, vague, or otherwise unsatisfactory. The actual scoring system is far too objective in general. For reference, 97% of banks pass their CRA exam, yet inequality is still rampant, showing that the exams aren't really that telling of actual inequality. The assessment areas are self-defined by banks and inconsistent. This could be kind of looked at as, like, I think some of the papers have said that banks will define it in terms of neighborhoods, whereas the actual data will come from census tracts. So the data right there is already kind of like mismatched and not exactly, a good picture of what these banks are doing. Low middle income lending does not always go to low middle income individuals. This can obviously cause gentrification. The CRA should uplift and incentivize development in these communities and not incentivize gentrification. Another one is the time that it takes to complete a CRA exam is long, and thus banks may have a difficult time adjusting the behavior to meet needs. Most of the papers that I've looked at kind of say that it's usually between 2 and 3 years that these exams take place, which again is far too long. Failures in how the law is actually written. As previously mentioned, almost all banks pass their CRA exams. The punishment for receiving an unsatisfactory grade is far too weak. The only repercussions for failing the exam is potential denial from regulators when banks are either merging with another bank or trying to buy a bank. This means that banks, in theory, can fail CRA exams consistently and continue to grow assets via more organic loan and deposit growth. Shortcomings in organization. There are 3 separate regulating authorities: the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC, which models efficiency. And too much responsibility is put on the low middle income areas to mobilize. Community development organizations and local coalitions carry too much of the burden of the desired effects of the CRA. And then for policy recommendations, one could be to work with the fintech industry to better utilize the changing financial landscape. I want to discuss what these potential relationships could look like, show examples of how this has already successfully been done. Citicorp and Lending Club did kind of came together in which Citi provided the capital, Lending Club provided like the loan originations for a third-party buyer of these loans. And the obvious question after that is, why didn't Citi just do it directly? Which I've talked about with Professor Kriegel a little bit, and I kind of am still a bit stumped on it too. I don't know why they wouldn't just do it directly. Even just having some of these relationships could potentially get more loans out to the people that need it and build up communities. And then finally, potentially including fintech firms in the CRA. Right now, they're pretty unregulated, but seeing as they're kind of like a new and up-and-coming industry, this could always be subject to change. Another potential policy recommendation is promoting coordination between the 3 regulatory agencies. Specifically, there could be a central database for all CRA data, as that is a big kind of like hiccup in the CRA process. And then to greatly improve the performance evaluations. Right now, it's kind of focused on just like qualitative data and not quantitative data. So if they could kind of move towards a more like concrete way of interpreting if these banks are actually serving their communities, I think that would be very beneficial. I think we could also add incentives for banks that go above and beyond the scope of law. As I mentioned before, like the penalties are not severe at all, and there aren't really any incentives for banks to kind of do this aside from not suffering these pretty minimal penalties. So providing that, could definitely help change the CRA landscape and improve lending in those areas. And then finally, to increase the punishments for banks that fail the CRA exams. Kind of like I said, it's really not that big of a deal. And already as is, 97% of banks pass it. So it's not really doing its job in that sense. And that is my presentation. It's very short. Open to any questions or comments.
It would be nice if CRA reduced the quality. That might be a little bit too high of a bar. But what it's supposed to do is increase banking, right? Getting people into the banking system. And so I think you ought to also look at that. Is it actually doing that? Okay. Because that's what it's really supposed to do. And so things like, does it reduce payday lending and all that stuff? If it does that, it's doing a lot. You may not pick it up in the already measure, but it's still successful.
Okay. Sorry, you said reducing pawn shop. What was the second example?
Payday lending, transaction outlets, all of those things. That's what people who don't have. Yeah, if you look back in the early years of Levy, it goes through all of the French things. There's a popular topic around things.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I had a part of my observation and comments that you already said, but following up on the effect on inequality and on wealth inequality, what would be the effect of having a better CRA implementation? That's, we have to also look at the other side, that it's not just enough to have a bank to give money, but it's other capacity to do. And what we're looking at the US now with the bank, it's a big problem for a lot of those who want to do that. So I don't know, you can get it, both sides of the equation. It's good to have access to finance, financial inclusion is good. But the legal is not. What's up? You're gonna get. Okay, that is next up, and then Justin, then Rudy, and then James. Okay, did I forget anybody? No? Okay, then, go.
So my presentation is on the effect of a secondary market corporate credit facility on eligible transportation sector issuers bond yield spread. Pretty long title. So my presentation is split up into objectives, literature review, methodology, and results. So for introduction, back last year during March of 2020, the Fed enacted lots of monetary policy programs. You have a commercial paper lending facility, you had a municipal lending facility for state and governments, you had PPP loans for small businesses, and one of these facilities was a secondary corporate credit facility. It was specifically meant for corporate bonds. So the United States Fed would buy the bonds of US companies and hold it as a portfolio. And to be eligible for purchase, you had to be issued by an eligible issuer, so you had to come from the United States. You had to have a rating of BBB minus or BBAA3. These are S&P and Moody's ratings. And you had to have a maturity of 5 years or less. So this was enacted back in 2020, so no longer than 2025. So the objectives, like what was the reason for this? Well, it was because last year was a time of uncertainty and lots of companies were affected around the US. The likelihood of default was a lot higher. So the Fed just wanted a way to provide liquidity in the financial market, specifically the secondary market, to the investors that held those bonds. So this is a pie chart. And the one to my left here is the overall size of the US debt back in 2019. And the one to the right is the United States Fed's portfolio of the purchase of corporate bond debt. And what you will realize here that is that it's capitalized weighted index. So what that means is that the Fed's portfolio matches to that of the overall US debt market. And you can see that, like, for example, from the transportation sector, where the overall size is 3.1%. And for the United States Fed, it's 2.7%. So relatively speaking, this portfolio tried to be proportional to that of the US debt market. And I just asked a question. We know that the transportation sector was greatly impacted by COVID. If you looked at its balance sheet and assets and liabilities, it was pretty bad. In fact, most of the companies' liabilities exceeded its assets. They had lots of tangible fixed assets coupled with the fact that it would depreciate in more than 50% by the first few years, because trains, freight trains, cars, airlines, these are lots of very, very expensive to maintain. So all of that took a toll on its revenue and income stream. So yeah, I tried to see if money allocated to this sector was enough for the companies that were eligible for this funding. So one important component of my thesis is the credit spread. You can calculate that by the equation 1 minus the recovery rate times the default probability. So you would take a firm default risk and subtract it by a risk-free or a relatively risk-free security. In this case, I use the U.S. Treasury. So this is an example I gave. If you have a 5-year Treasury bond trading at 1.3%, 1.32%, and a corporate bond trading at a higher yield because investors will want higher money to make up of a higher probability of default. This case is at 4.32%. Then the difference is a 3% default risk. Or you can also say that this company is 300 basis points above the US Treasury. Yeah, so that's an example, and it's an indicator of economic well-being. The tightening and whitening of the spreads reflects the investor's concern. So an increase or a higher spread is not a good thing, because that means that investors are demanding higher interest rate payments to make up of a higher probability of default. And a tightening spread is a good thing because it's driving bond prices higher and yields lower because there's an increase in demand. So these are some authors that have also done pretty related research. The first one on top consists of Federal Reserve chairmen and professors from prestigious universities. And what they did is they looked at the corporate credit facility as a whole and measured the spread before and after the announcement. So the equation you see here is the credit spread of the treatment variable. So what that is are the bonds that actually made it into the facility and were able to be funded. The difference between that and the bonds that were ineligible, maybe they had a maturity here of like longer than 5 years, or there weren't US company bonds, or their credit ratings was too low. And they used that as a dependent variable. And for the independent variable, look at the bonds that were trading during that time around March and April. And what they did is they made 2 different panel data. And so T star, sorry if it's like a bit too small to see, but that's T star. It composed of like 2 different announcements, March 23rd and April 9th. And what they did is if a bond was trading at a time after the announcement, it was put in one category, and if it was trading before the announcement, it was placed in another category. So they pretty much did that to show that, to show what was the difference in their credit spreads before and after the announcement. Was there a type of announcement effect? And since this is a panel data regression model that had a fixed effect variable, and what that pretty much does is control for time and invariant characteristics. So what that means is that every single firm may have a certain feature that may be unique to that firm that may affect the correlation of a model. And that's not good because it can lead to autocorrelation, to spurious effects such as, omitted variable biases and all that stuff. So the control for that, leaving the error term, which is time variable or time variant effects. So features that can be moved freely over time. So that was one offer, and the offers at the bottom here had a model like this, which pretty much just showed the spreads of the different sectors before and after the announcements were made. As you can see, what I tried to analyze was the transportation sector. So the one to the right, the blue lines, just shows the basis points. I'm not sure what benchmark they used, but the ones to the left show how much for decrease after the Fed has made the announcements. So my methodology is split up into 2 portions. One is when I try to compare the eligible and non-eligible bonds from the same company of a transportation companies that were eligible for this funding. And it's split up into 3 different segments: March 23rd announcement, the April 9th announcement, and the post-Fed purchase. And the data I used, similar to other offers before me, was the FINRA trace. It's just composed of bond transactions, the current yield to maturity, the interest rates, etc. And yeah. So these were the companies that were eligible for funding for this special purpose vehicle. You might see some familiar names like FedEx or United States Union Pacific Corp or United Parcel. So yeah. The company that released that actually got the most funding was Burlington Northern Santa. No reasons why, just the Fed purchased more bonds than others for some reason. So what I did is I went into to FINRA, like I said, because they had a list of bond transactions, and I took those bonds. I looked at the dates that they were trading at of a yield that the dates was composed of, and I compared it to a yield of a U.S. Treasury of similar maturity. So in this case, the Burlington company was trading at a yield of around like 2.3% initially back in March. And so I took the U.S. Treasury yield, and this is a 10-year bond. So I also looked at the 10-year Treasury bond and did the difference of those two, and then plugged it in a graph and looked at its trajectory from before and after the announcement and after the purchase of the Fed. So this is the first graph I did. So if you could see, there was a pretty high increase in credit spreads before the March 23rd announcements. But after the Fed has announced the whole intent of the credit facilities, there has been a decrease since. And on April 9th, the Fed pretty much announced that it would increase its purchase of corporate bonds, and it led to an even further decrease. And by the time the Fed actually started purchasing the bonds, they were trading at a yield lower than the Treasury, which is quite remarkable. And this is one of the many companies that I did. I mean, I pretty much did all of them. And yeah, just like FedEx, for example. By the time the Fed actually purchased the bonds, most of them were trading at yields actually lower than the government. And it shows that there was, in fact, excess liquidity in the US market for these corporate bonds at the time. So yeah. And after this first part of my methodology, the second part was composed of so in summary, the actual Fed purchase did in fact reduce the credit spread for most of these firms. And oops, skip one. Right. And so afterwards, I tried to assess how the credit spreads of the transportation sectors responded to the overall market. And so these are offers that also looked at similar works in terms of credit spread determinants. Most of them concluded that like variables such as the slope of the yield curve or market volatility is a good indicator of credit spread. So my objective was to see how volatile the credit spreads of the transportation sectors company were able to fluctuate with a troubling market that occurred last year. So based on the works of these offers, these are my explanatory variables for my empirical model. So I have an S&P index for the transportation sector return, the slope of a yield curve, and the variable interest volatility interest rate for the bonds. So and these are my expected correlation after I actually do the model. You know, I expect to have a negative correlation for the S&P index because It's quite the opposite. A reduction in credit spread is a good economic indicator, while a rise in share price in the stock market is a good economic indicator. So we should be moving in opposite directions. I also have a slope of the yield curve. As we know, in an inverted yield curve can lead to a recession, or a downward sloping yield curve is not a good thing. And a positive yielding curve is a good sign of economic health. So that also has a negative relationship. And the volatility interest rate has a positive relationship, because increase in volatility is not a good thing, similar to how an increase in credit spread is not a good thing. So that has a positive relationship. And so for my empirical model, this is what I'm going to conclude. So initially I was going to do a multiple linear regression model, but as we see here, it can lead to omitted variable biases, into other forms of errors, multipolarity, autocorrelation. And since this is a panel regression model composed of cross-sectional and time series, I would have to use a fixed effect model, just like the previous authors before me, because we want to control for time invariant characteristics. This is especially important because we just want to measure the credit spread from the transportation sectors as a dependent variable and have it respond into a macroeconomic effect, like the slope of the yield curve, etc. So yeah, so based on that result, I have here my regression model with n-1 dummy variable. So what I've done here is I've plugged in the transportation sectors as a dummy variable, and I did that to control the fixed effect. So just to make my correlation a bit more accurate. And you can see here that slope of a yield curve, S&P index, and the volatility of the interest rate is my explanatory variables. And yeah, so based on this model, we should have an accurate results as to how these macroeconomic variables affect the credit spread of the transportation sector. And we're doing this mostly for policy implications to see how the Fed can better respond should there be another crisis in the future or anything else. And that's about it.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
Yep.
Very sure Hathaway. So what we're doing is putting money in the development.
Right. Because he controls that.
Second, you might take a minute just to explain why you focused on transportation, to explain a little bit more why you focused on transportation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the transportation sector, it's extremely cyclical. So in times of good economic, health, it prospers. But usually when we come into a recession, or in this case, a pandemic where we have lockdowns and restrictions, it's extremely vulnerable. Like I said, it has composed a lot of tangible fixed assets, and its balance sheet and income statements was greatly disrupted. So during this period of time, the transportation sector in particular was greatly affected by the pandemic, and not just the consumer side with the airlines, but also when you think about the cargoes that are usually being transported around for for products and goods and services. Like we hear this in the news, like chip shortages, for example, or the amount of ship containers that are just contained at sea and aren't able to make it to the stores and our supply shelves. This is all part of it. So yeah, that's it.
The key word here is supply chain.
So yeah, supply chain. Any other questions?
BNSF is owned by Buffett.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, and there was a lot of controversies as to the companies that the Fed decided to invest in, because some made the argument that they really need funding, as opposed to certain other transportation companies that probably could have done with that money a bit more than the bigger ones. Yeah.
Are there any connection between like the list yellow companies like their characteristics, their balance sheets at the time of the crisis that led to the Fed
is there a justification for it?
I doubt it. I don't think the Fed really justified anything. Like I said, they tried to approach it like a capitalized index weighted. So they try to match the market's cap of the actual US debt market to its portfolio. So I'm guessing there was a lower percentage of transportation sector debt because when you look at the US rated debt, there wasn't much debt out there for the transportation sector. So
Tom, if you think of it this way, when the ECB decided to do their similar intervention, like everywhere, they used the capital key for the participation of each group in the ECB. And basically, this was very much like the capital key. Any bond that fits this category, we buy. That's more or less the same thing that ECB does. So my presumption is that what they would do it is they were looking back and say, if anybody asks the question that you ask, we're going to say, okay, this is the way that this is done.
and there were things I wanted to touch on that I didn't get a chance to talk about. Like, for example, you have the announcement effect. The fact that the Fed can just announce the fact that it's going to purchase the bond, and it's more than enough to actually get the spreads to lower, or the spillover effect. So the red bonds, for example, is one that's ineligible. The blue bonds is eligible. We see that they're both moving at similar directions, although the government actually only purchased the blue eligible bonds. And many authors call that the spillover effect. So it may have only purchased certain securities, but investors perceived it as if the whole entire market was going to be funded with liquidity. It's a positive economic outlook. And so it led to a similar reduction in spread. And yeah, so these were some pretty remarkable findings. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Good, Martha? All right. Good morning, or maybe good afternoon at this point. My name is Justin Fuming. I'm a second-year graduate student here at Levy, and the working title of my thesis is The Impact of Paid Parental Leave on the Division of Intra-Household Childcare Work. The table of contents outlines the chapters for my thesis. First, I discuss social economic theory, focusing mainly on Marx's work regarding class relations within capitalism. Next, I present a brief contextual history of the United States to gain a better understanding of social and cultural norms. Specifically, I focus on accepted but outdated gender roles. Then I present the arguments in favor of a paid parental leave policy and use other economists' work to support the extension of the policy to encompass both parents. I review existing state legislation before constructing my regression model, discussing the results and identifying its policy implications, bless you, within the context of the United States. Consider the term exploitation. If you're an economist, like most of us, you're likely to think of Marx. That's because Marx argues that exploitation and class conflict are innate characteristics of any capitalist economy. While workers push to improve their working conditions and pay, capitalists try to do the exact opposite to maximize profits. Susan Ferguson calls this a necessary but contradictory social relation. Both social classes need each other to survive. The worker needs to earn income to support himself. Capitalists need to employ workers to produce commodities and accumulate surplus value. The contradiction obviously comes from both social classes being pitted against one another. The necessity comes from the fact that workers must engage in this exploitation to survive, which allows this aspect of capitalism to reproduce itself over time. Without intervention, further engagement would only lead to the persistence of exploitative conditions. A third party must step in to create lasting change of any kind. Marx's work can be applied to specific segments of capitalism. One such example is the contribution of household work to capitalism in reproducing the worker. Care work and household work are largely relegated to the private sector and therefore unpaid. This labor sits squarely within the economic structure while simultaneously sitting outside of the purview of firm production. The demographic of these care workers is undoubtedly largely women. To understand Marx's work in this regard, we must understand first that the production of goods and services and the production of life itself are both part of one integrated process. If we agree that public and are interdependent, we can then understand how women are exploited even further than men in a system of capitalism. Unpaid household work not only enables the reproduction of existing workers, but the development of children as future workers. This type of work includes childcare, cooking, cleaning, etc. Because of the social relation between production and reproduction, we cannot adequately understand the functioning of the economy while separating the market from the household. Since markets are inherently political, as Ha-Joon states, we must view the entire private sector structure, considering the political system in place with all of its policies. If women are assigned greater responsibilities for the creation and maintenance of human capabilities than men, the path to gender equality will never be realized. Policy intervention should be able to contribute to distribute this burden more evenly. Social norms undoubtedly play a vital role in defining gender roles in our country. Before the onset of the Second World War, there had been a concrete notion that described fathers as the primary breadwinner and mothers as the primary caretaker. While the burden of providing financially fell heavily on men, women were required to handle the social and private burden of sustaining and reproducing the household. This structure was cultivated through TV shows, advertisements, and magazines, to name a few. For example, ads for items such as vacuum cleaners were solely directed at women, since it was assumed that only they would use such appliances. This one-income stereotypical household led to women form some degree of subordination by default, since they were dependent on their husbands financially. They were considered the male workers' support at the home. The beginning of the World War II featured a unique opportunity for women to finally enter the workplace, replacing men who were needed to serve in the military. Many firms increased their demand for female labor since there were no other options. Because of this, women's participation in the labor force became much more normalized. Following the war, women resumed their role in the household, but only for a short time. The women's rights movement of the 60s helped concretely shift the perception of their roles to be that of economically productive agents in society. The notion that women were only a supportive structure lost its foundation as more dual-income households emerged. By the end of the 60s, the burden of paid labor fell more evenly on both men and women. However, on the flip side, the household dynamic remained the same. A broad refusal to help with care work by men, explicitly or implicitly, led to a double burden of labor which fell upon women, who are now tasked with household work on top of their income-generating activities. In this realm of economics, the double burden is hotly debated topic. Some data shows that the overall work hours between men and women have equalized since the latter half of the 20th century. However, an important note must be made regarding this result. Household work has historically left out hours dedicated to childcare. When childcare is included, a wide gap in the hours remains. In fact, it is cited that equality among married couples diminishes as they transition to parenthood. Despite the strides we've made thus far, there remains a belief that women should be primarily in the household. In fact, a survey found 1 in 4 men favor an arrangement where they only work full-time while their partner stays at home. Within the same survey, it was found that young couples are no more likely to divide household work equitably than their older couple counterparts. So now we turn to paid parental leave. So what is it? It is an employee benefit that provides paid time off from the workforce to care for a newborn child or newly adopted child. It's subtly different from what's known as family leave, which encompasses the care for a sick elderly member as well. A policy such as this would surely allow the society of the United States to take another step toward gender equality. It would allow new parents, both mothers and fathers, to bond with their child and get used to all the things that come with being a parent. Parents would receive replacement wages to provide financial stability during this time, which is especially important considering there are essential child-specific out-of-pocket costs that non-parents do not incur. Why is it needed? Parents cannot simply deny others from benefiting from their efforts in child rearing, nor does one's consumption of these benefits result in limiting another's consumption. These are characteristics known as non-exclusivity and non-excludability, and they are why child rearing should be considered a public good. A paid parental leave, while parents are the ones who supply the labor required for child rearing, they are not the only ones receiving the benefits. Since all citizens reap the benefits of children as future productive workers, the fairness principle argues in favor of sharing the cost of children between parents and non-parents. A paid parental leave policy would bridge the gap between the benefit of the child and the cost of raising them, at least in the earliest stages of parenthood. If this program were to be funded by society as a collective, the free riding problem would also be eliminated, at least in the early stage of childhood. Alternative solutions to the children as a public good argument have been proposed by other scholars. One idea proposes to distribute the benefits of children solely to parents, such as by having a social security fund specifically for this demographic. This would require too many resources to sustain, however, and there still is a problem that society will benefit from the productivity of children as future workers. Another solution calls for the public provision of child care facilities to extrapolate child care from the household. However, the application of a welfare state to this sector may severely undervalue workers, creating a vulnerable group of underpaid care and domestic workers. Further, given the political context of the United States, it is unlikely that the administration would be able to pass such a large spending bill in these areas. Why not both? So now we turn to the question of why this policy should encompass both mothers and fathers. The assumption that males are the default breadwinner is quite outdated. While likely true in the mid-20th century, women not only make up about half of the labor force now, but they are also much more likely to be the primary earner than ever before. The relative resources argument posits that the partner who brings the most resources to a relationship has the most power, enabling them to opt out of household labor. This theory has often been used to make the case for the prevailing gender roles. However, as much as 41% of mothers are now the sole or primary breadwinner for their families, proving this theory outdated. Another obstacle that this policy may be helpful in overcoming is the stigmatization of child rearing being a feminine task. Many men have cited fear of stigmatization, career consequences, social disapproval, or economic constraints, which prohibit them from taking advantage of unpaid leave. The stigma remains even as fathers have become less likely to be the breadwinner in dual income households. It's likely that gender roles are stickier without the intervention from a third party. However, we have seen that there is no longer economic dependency on fathers. It is rather a co-op between both parents now. To help eliminate these archaic gender ideologies, a paid leave policy that encompasses both parents is needed. Finally, we address the capacity of each parent performing the job of caretaker. Literature in this area is relatively new. That's because historically there haven't been many sample points where the male is the primary caretaker in the household. Nevertheless, it turns out that stay-at-home dads and more generally, males who are the primary caretaker parent in similar ways to mothers. When required to, fathers can be fully responsible for the child. This result nullifies the alternative theory that women are biologically better suited at childbearing. Now we'll analyze the paid leave policies abroad. At this point, we turn to other countries and assess their capacities in supporting families. It's not a groundbreaking statement to say that the United States lags well behind other rich developed countries by not mandating paid parental leave. In fact, the US is one of only 8 countries to not offer any form of paid maternity leave, which is specific to mothers. They remain in the minority when it comes to offering paid paternity leave, which is for fathers. Over half of the world offers it in some form. The average length of paid maternity leave, with an M, is globally is 29 weeks. The average length of paid paternity leave is 16 weeks. In the US, the numbers are 0 and 0, respectively. In a panel study of 24 different countries that offer paid paternity leave, it was found that paid leave is most effective when it couples a high income replacement with a period of leave greater than 2 weeks. Some of the countries that fit these parameters are the Nordic countries, which include Norway, Sweden, and Finland, who also happen to rank very high in terms of gender equality. Finland has one of the most innovative policy structures because they split the total time off into 3 parts. 1/3 must be taken by mothers, another third must be taken by fathers, and the last third can be used discretionarily. Other countries have adjusted their policies similarly to increase the rate at which fathers take off from work, such as in Sweden, where 1 month of leave must be taken by fathers. Others have increased the replacement wage offered and found success. For example, in Quebec, Canada, they changed their policy to replace a higher percentage of wages for fathers. Prior to the implementation, 32% of fathers took leave. After, though, the number jumped dramatically to 76%, showing that if the incentives are there, it will impact the parent's decision to take leave. In most cases, the policies are funded through Social Security programs or disability insurance, which are paid by mandatory employee payroll taxes. They offer replacement wages in the form of cash transfer, usually with both lower and upper bound limits. While it's likely not feasible within the United States current political landscape to offer such extensive leave policies as the ones we see in Europe, a policy which follows the bare minimum, which includes adequate wage replacement and enough time off, is a good starting point. Currently, there is no nationwide paid parental leave policy. There is, however, the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, which grants 12 weeks of unpaid job-protected leave annually. This time off can be used to care for a newborn or elderly family member. While a step in the right direction, the US still lags behind the rest of the world. Perhaps ironically, the US government does, however, offer 12 weeks of paid parental leave to its employees through a separate law. The current structure of the FMLA doesn't even cover all citizens. In fact, only 59% of all workers are eligible to be covered by the FMLA, and even less are eligible and can afford to take advantage of this benefit. For single parents, matters are even worse. It's almost impossible for them to take off from work without other sources of financial support. For the purpose of this paper, we will focus on 3 states in particular who have their own policies in place above the federal minimum. There are other states, as well as Washington D.C., who have policies either in place or in the process of being enacted. But New Jersey, Rhode Island, and California are at the forefront of this movement of implementing their own policies. California was the first state to implement a paid parental leave policy in 2004. Their program covers 55% of wages for up to 6 weeks of leave for new parents. New Jersey was the second to follow suit. Their law was enacted in 2009. It covers 66% of wages for a period of 6 weeks. Rhode Island enacted their leave in 2014, and they offer up to 4 weeks of paid time off with 60% wage replacement. All 3 states construct their policies in similar ways. While they don't directly ensure job protection, the FMLA does that for them. They have an upper bound threshold for weekly benefits given to an individual. They're also all administered similarly. The policy coverage is added on to pre-existing temporary disability insurance and funded via employee payroll deductions. The question this paper seeks to answer is this: what is the impact, if any, of a paid parental leave policy on the division of childcare work within the household? Our hypothesis is that paid parental leave, which by definition, reminder, encompasses both parents, will lead to a more equal division of childcare labor. To answer this question, we will construct a difference in difference model for the 3 case studies, which are the 3 states, California, New Jersey, Rhode Island. We'll compare each to the average of all the other states, which represent the untreated group, because they don't have any policies in place. The dependent variable is childcare work, expressed in hours per year. It's expressed in log form so that we can get the percentage changes. And this variable was constructed using data from the American Time Use Survey. It consists of 3 main activities relating to a child's health, overall well-being, and education. The control variables are education, age, income, marital status, sex, race, employment status, the state they reside in, and the weight of the observations. All the data will be collected from the American Time Use Survey, which has available data from the states in question from 2003 to 2019, which happens to include at least 1 full year of data before and after each policy implementation. The observations are narrowed down to only include parents. The model seeks to assess the difference between the amount of childcare work during the year immediately preceding the enactment of the parental leave and the year immediately following it. The model will provide difference estimators for each treated group and untreated group, which we can then subtract. We can subtract the untreated from the treated to get the difference in difference estimator. The next steps as I continue to write my thesis are as follows. I'll finish cleaning the data and fine-tuning my model and obtain the results for the difference estimators. I'll then discuss the results both in isolated terms and what it implies for public policy. Finally, I'll outline areas of future research and also reflect on my own model's limitations. Thank you, and any feedback is welcome.
Do you have any suggestions on how to parental leave policy in the United States? Or just like in your model, you would just have the notes that already have it.
I'm trying to focus on the policies that are in place that are better in these states and seeing what that implies for the nation as a whole. It'll likely have to be implemented state by state because as it stands now, each state has like their own disability insurance programs and they fund that through payroll taxes. And so in New Jersey, Rhode Island, California, they include paid leave under disability insurance, short-term disability insurance. And if that's the case for these 3 states, I'll try to extend that to all of the states and advocate for that. Sure, yeah.
Have a similar system, like getting a new country where they, a third of the time it's for not in a heterosexual different family. A third of the time it's for the mom, a third of the time it's for the dad. Decided for them, or
so
like 4 weeks of parental leave, so it's like 1 week.
No, so they don't go as far as to mandate which parents have to take however much time off. Yeah.
Probably know that New York State now has policy.
Yes. Yeah. It just came at a later time, and the data doesn't extend that far.
I think in comparison to Europe, I think that the federated nature of American policy is an asset. It can be an asset. I would consider the relationship to comparison with Europe in that context. Also, it's an upside that individual states are experiment and expand policies at that level. And of course, some states are larger economic units than some countries. And
I'm sorry, maybe I didn't follow. Was that a question? Was there a question in there?
It's a comment on your initial statement in relation to comparison of the U.S. to European countries, where you said the U.S. has 0.
Right.
So I think it's come back and answer it. But in framing, I think it's often the way certain states in the U.S. are comparable to nations.
Right.
Policy power.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Did I understand the model correctly that you obtained 3 estimators of the change?
Yeah, so it'll be California compared to the untreated group, New Jersey compared to the untreated group.
So in the end, you have 3 estimates of the impact of those policies.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was wondering, have you thought about approaching it from the panel approach and then having the staggered implementation, so the dummies being one and the period of implementation? Because all 3 policies seem fairly similar. Right? So they are one about 4 weeks, one of 6 weeks. This range. So you could think about doing it at the panel and then having the time date fixed effect, which shows the average effect of the implementation of those policies. Because then you could have one single estimate again and not 3 different.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I'm still freshening up on the methodology through reading the Wooldridge textbook and looking at supplementary sources. So my model is definitely not set in stone. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yes, a couple of points. First of all, because there is differential time, you cannot really do a final approach. A lot of what has come in the last 2 years says, don't do that unless you really show that the effect is the same for everyone. However, you can still aggregate those 3 separate measures into a single one, just with a correct way to have it, which you can do at some point. The other 2 points that I have, which are more concerned with your model, which might stretch a little bit your data. Number 1, you probably want to concentrate only on families that have a younger child, either between 0 to 1, 0 to 5, because those are the ones that are going to be potential benefits for the parental policy, because they are the like just after the form. The other thing is just be aware that, and this is the part that's going to stretch the data quite a lot. The time you survey, the American Family Survey has information on 1 person in the household. So you might have to do this separately for either if the household happens to be the one that has the father or the mother, and to identify these children respect to them. So the other time is going to be constrained a little bit, but I think you will have to do those restrictions in order to identify if these policies have any impact on the time use of the parents.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, one more thing, sorry. Do not include the state fixed effects because that's the only variation for the policy in the state. So not the state fixed effects, and we don't really control or do it as a variable, but to weight information to take into account. And probably the weights are not going to be as relevant in this. But again, once you start working on that implementation,
Sure.
When your question related to data, the EQS, think about pooling the data from a number of ways together. The reason for that is that a single ATUS wave is not representative with the state. If you want, sufficient number of observations to be representative of the state, more like 3 to 5 years. The second question is more, I guess, the more modest. In the beginning, you talked about pre-K care, early childhood education, but like taking the responsibility out of the family and socialize.
Right. Yeah.
This is that, I don't think that they're necessarily conflicting with each other. In other words, parental leave can only be at the most like for a few weeks, or maybe a few months, or maybe a year, not beyond. But they are actually complementary. It's not that we can think about the parental leave as a subsidy for early childhood. I think that's what we want both.
Right. I think the point I was trying to make is that if we were to not offer paid parental leave and just have, childcare facilities take care of kids all the time, that would, funded by the government, that would undervalue the workers. Does that make sense?
Well, I depends a lot on whether the government wants to make them.
It depends. Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends how they value that sector as a whole.
Right. And that has other positive effects. You can go to this point with the multiplier effect, right? Rather than giving the money to the kid. Broader.
Oh, sure.
Other time?
What you're trying to identify is the impact on childcare time spent by the parents. Are you trying to identify the impact during the period of parental leave or after the period?
That's a great question. It might be, yeah, it might be better to do both, because I would ideally like to see the long-term effects of the division of health, childcare labor. I would hope that it's not just a one-time thing and then it goes back to pre-paid leave policies.
The former might be really difficult to identify. It might be hard to find the people who are on
Right.
leave or.
Right. So then, in that case, I would take the average effects after the implementation of the policy.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, this is great. Keep them coming.
Like, get friends and I don't know if this data was the data, but in replacement wage level, ability to single connection between higher replacement wage. I'm not sure how much variation to what
Yeah, so there is, the variation between the wage replacements varies from 55% to 66%, which in my opinion is not that much. Also for single parents, it's very unlikely they'll be able to take off. I feel like, for now, I would like to just focus on couples, because if they have the options, who takes off if there is a discussion, or that's could be part of my future research. Thank you.
It's not working. There's a specific way to
You know how to share?
yeah, sure. I wanna log into my email. But the mouse is not working properly.
Yeah, it doesn't work like that. You have to tap. So if you tap, it opens.
Tap.
Tap, not click. Tap.
Okay.
Where is your stuff in your email?
In the email.
Say got it. Tap. Yeah. Tap. And then tap it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or you want it
No,
different?
that's
Is that
okay.
okay? Okay.
So my subject is about stranded assets in oil and gas. And the title is Stranded or Not, Measuring the Transitioning into Low Carbon Asset. So starting with the background, there was an agreement in Paris 2015 to limit the emission of dioxide carbon below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level to mitigate climate change. And the question is, how much of the world remaining proven oil and gas and coal reserves would have to remain unburnable to ensure that we comply with this agreement in Paris? And by remaining unburnable, that implies that these assets are now stranded in the sense that they have lost their value, certain value, and they became stranded. So according to some estimates, 2/3 of these assets cannot be burned. They cannot be monetized and should be discounted from the balance sheets of companies that own them. These are stranded assets that should be divested or written down. And on the balance sheets for companies, for oil and gas companies, the value of these assets is affected. For investors, the market value of the equity and debt holding are at stake, which are liabilities for the oil companies. So the question to ask is how much of these reserves will become stranded or obsolete? What are the macroeconomic and financial implications under each scenario of the Paris Agreement? How financial markets are pricing this risk? How can we quantify or assess the uncertainty of the pace and scale of the transition into low carbon or renewable energy policies? And ultimately, who own these reserves? Who assume the stranded asset risks? And what are the forces driving or slowing this transition or that risk?
So the forces that are accelerating the transition are tighter climate policies, improvement in renewables and energy efficiency, the increased financial risk perceived by investors, so the higher interest on bonds and the repricing of equities, the technological disruption if renewable energies have become more cost competitive, and that all demand is growing at a decreasing pace now. So we ask ourselves the question: is there a carbon bubble growing up, building up, and which will burst very soon, and later, which will lead to investors' destruction of wealth? That's one part of the coin, and then the second part is we're gonna see the forces decelerating or slowing this transition, and apparently we have a host of technical, social, political, and commercial obstacles that rapid transition into a global energy infrastructure. Technologies, renewable technologies are not mature enough to compete with fossil-based energy. Governments still retain the upper hand in the transition into renewable energy and to complying with the Paris Agreement. And we have the regulatory capture, so the incumbents now are blocking this disruption through lobbying government, through regulation and laws. So we ask ourselves the second question: the transition seems to be lengthy, and hence the questions of stranded asset could be overrated now. This risk of stranded asset will get priced slowly over time as market shift gradually to low carbon energy. So nothing is certain to some extent whether we have a smooth transition or a carbon bubble. We still ask ourselves this question. But then we narrow down the problem and we ask some other question in terms of the NOC and the IOC. So the IOC are the international oil companies and the NOC are the national oil companies, which provide us a different picture. So much of the ownership of oil and gas reserves rests with national government whose state-owned oil companies, NOC, do not offer equity for trading in the financial market. The largest publicly traded private oil companies, IOC, hold a total reserves of 49 million barrels. That's only 3% of total proven world reserves. In comparison, the share of world oil reserves by nations that are members of OPEC is 97%, and these are controlled by countries. And they don't trade in the capital market, and they don't make their financial statements available. So our views and intended goals is that the burden of stranded assets will fall more squarely on NOCs rather than on IOCs. And NOCs, national companies, are controlled by petro-sovereign states. The capital market may be failing to price the risk of stranded assets, exposing owners and investors to potential lost value. The NOCs have not sufficiently factored in the possibility of that future demand could be significantly reduced by some endogenous market macroeconomic variables from the petrostate owning the NOCs. And our intended goals is to help stakeholders, policymakers, and business leaders, and researchers also understand and quantify this implied risk and help government understand the factors that affect these assets, the stranded assets, adopt an adequate strategy to transition to low carbon through divestment and or writing off high carbon investment, and or through investing into renewable energies and speeding up economic diversification in their countries, because most of them still rely on oil, and on 90% of the exports are in and still in war. So they don't have enough economic diversification, and thus they are vulnerable to economic shocks. So our research question is, there are like 3-4 main research questions. To which extent our range of financial, macroeconomic, and political factors affect the value of these assets. So some of them put pressure on assets becoming stranded, and some of them relieving the pressure. And we're gonna see in a few minutes what are those financial, economic, and political factors. The second research question is, are NOCs able to continue with the same production pace in fossil fuels even with the rest of the world decarbonizing? The third question is, what are the implications of this for these countries in their ability and resilience to adapt to significant revenue losses in case a substantial chunk of these assets became stranded and lost value? And are markets underpricing along long-dated future risks such as climate change? So my methodology is to build a model. So asset value fossil fuel reserves would be affected by a range of explanatory variables. So first, sovereign debt, second, fiscal space, economic diversification, foreign reserves, sovereign wealth funds, companies, bonds risk, sovereign risk, and political risk. And I'm gonna take the data of mostly the 40 nations that own national oil companies. And for each of these nations, they have this data. And also, an additional explanatory variable would be external global demand with assumption of an average price. And I'm gonna control for renewable and or alternative energies and climate change policies. So we control for technological advances and in renewable or alternative energy, and we control also for climate change policies. Our dependent variable asset value is meant to be proven fossil fuel reserves. The fiscal space is measured in terms of fiscal deficit to GDP, provided the inexistence of a currency sovereignty. Economic diversification is measured through the share of non-oil export through in terms of total oil export, in terms of total exports. Companies' bonds risk is measured through either their ability to access and the cost of accessing international financial markets, so the credit rating or the spread from treasury bill, as well as the same applies to sovereign risk. Political risk is measured through indices and indicates the stability and predictability of political and policy decision making, in addition to the efficiency of public institutions. And external global demand is based on assumptions from international specialized agencies like the International Agency EAI, I guess. And that's it. Thank you. Well, I was thinking at first to do some kind of projection, but running an econometric model would force me to use past data, right? So yeah, so there are so many projections that have been done, and mostly they use the two variables, which are climate policies and investment in renewable energies. I'm gonna control for these two, and I'm gonna see how the macroeconomic indicators in these petrostates that owns national companies affect or could affect the value of assets in oil and gas. So I'm not gonna do any projection now.
Oh, well, I was thinking that it would be a good exercise just take the IMF baseline kind of growth forecast for the main macroeconomic, right? And then you can plug in different trajectories in terms of the global climate change, right? And then see what the differences will be across that. I think because a number of things are going to get implemented, hopefully, after the last summit. So that can make a difference to what's going to be interesting.
Right, of course. Maybe that would be a complementary for this, but
Right.
yeah. I mean, measuring measuring the impact of the loss of value from the economic structure of these states, and we're controlling for climate policy changes coming from mostly from supranational entities like the UN and the World Bank and the EU and the US, so coming from the West. And so I'm gonna see how to do that, like maybe a complementary research. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, you're cool. Did you log out?
No.
No. Okay. So let's go back to the other one. No, go. No. Go here. And then, may I? And then you were, where's your Google phone? Oh, you're still here. So we have to log you. How do you do that? Do you know how to, ¿sabes cómo?
Manage your account.
No, I have to go down, right?
This needs to be manage your account.
See, I have a manage my account.
Yes.
It's a new browser.
No,
No.
no, that's not it. I have a Mac, so I don't know how to use it. So how do you do it?
Yes.
Here, right? Sign up?
Yes.
We're learning good. So now, ahora tú, Julius. ¿Sabes cómo darle al Zoom?
Sí.
Sí. Okay. Yo te digo desde atrás. ¿Sí? Dale.
I don't know. Okay. Amazing. Okay. How do you move from? After that, so demanding setup. First, my name is Julius Duran. I am from El Salvador. I am a first student who started in the second semester, so that's why I'm doing now the thesis after right now. And the main idea of my thesis, because I come from El Salvador, usually when people talk about Latin America, we have a lot of dependencies, as Angie mentioned before. However, Latin America is a heterogeneous continent, and one of them, like Central American countries, not only depend on commodities, but also we depend on remittances. And additionally, in the last years, we have seen there's in the news that there's a big migrant crisis, but it's not the population who has been the crisis, it's the lack of response of the government to how to solve this important migration flow. In absolute and relative terms, migration has increased. Migration has important impacts both in countries that are origins and countries of destinations. And from a democratic perspective, the demographic perspective, this implicates that a lot of people migrate, in particular young population. In addition, migration and his consequences are remittances, who are important source of financial resources for developing countries. And I believe that it's important to understand what is the development path of these countries. Okay, this is the outline, the justification, the hypothesis, my thesis goal, and a little bit biography review. And I have to figure out which methodology to use one step at a time. First, as I mentioned before, the highly dependency. Countries depend on export people, exclude people of their home country in order to reduce pressures about labor, about demanding the government. In addition, remittances represent an important flow not only of the currency, but also because to reduce poverty. In addition, lack of the effectiveness of policy response address migration, particularly in a supply side. It is about investment, increase human capital. And even one of the expected result of the Washington Consensus was the migration. What we have here, what we have here, there is a statistic that used the United Nations that is tell you how many people get into your country, less how many people have left. It is the result of the stock in a period of 5-time period. And this is divided by 100 population of this. So what it tells us that if we have yellow, red, or green, more people have left the country. We have blue, more people have returned, or more people have get in. So I select countries who have experienced a 2% population has left in a period of 5-year period. And I found like there are at least 30 countries who have experienced a period of sending 2% of its population. There is an important amount. And then I checked, I wanted to see what happens if there are countries who are constantly exporting people, excluding people. And what I found, well, I divided this by continent. And if we see in European countries, there are 3 of them who has constantly sent people, North Macedonia, Bosnia, Albania. The political and socioeconomic reasons, it has to get deeper, but we find that there is a constant flow of population in all countries, even though some of them experience 4% of the population has left in a period of 5 years. That's a lot, considering there is the young population. Then what will happen is the demographic bonus of developing countries are migrating. Also, we find 2 other aspects, in particular European countries. After the Washington Consensus, a lot of countries have experienced net population, exporting population. In addition, well, we see other African countries, small countries like Cabo Verde, Lesotho, Principle, I experienced a constant outflow of population. I did this also for Oceanian countries, and we see like particularly Iceland countries that constantly has sent people. In addition, we have some of them like in Asian countries like Armenia, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan who has sent population constantly also. Some of them, however, have experienced some process that some return of population. So at least there is not decreasing the population. The main point is that we see the population process in developing countries, because all the countries we have some are only developing countries. They flow it from developing countries to developed countries. And we see here also that constantly a lot of countries have experienced outflow population. Here is Salvador, my home country, so we see like there is a constant depopulation process. In addition, there is a highly dependency of remittances. Right now, remittances are higher than the foreign domestic investment, the official development assistance, and portfolio debt and equality. As we see, there is no market force. I mean, the solidarity between families living abroad are higher than the market and in multilateral agreements source of financial source. So how we organize the world right now is not helping the population that suffer from a lot of migration or underdevelopment process. Well, what I got here is like I found like all these countries that how many depend of them, how many of them have experienced a process where remittances is equivalent at least of more than 20% of the GDP. I found all these countries, but Honduras, Guatemala, Jamaica, El Salvador, Georgia, Jordan, Kyrgyz Republic. A few of them also are in the group of countries that I mentioned before that constantly has sent people, like El Salvador, Kyrgyzstan Republic, Nepal, and Tonga. So what we see is like this highly dependency of remittances, what allows to a lot of the developing countries to close the deficit trade. Usually a lot of countries, these are net importers. And also there is this country that allows you to have a lot of foreign currency. In addition, it's a complete source of income, in particular to poverty population, that allows to reduce poverty. And what had been the main response to this economic problem? Well, the primary focus has been supply side. And usually we hear constantly, at least in the news, we have to address the root cause of migration or the economic drivers. And the primary focus has been increasing human capital, improving education, training, health, investment and growth. In addition, the implementation of some programs say like it will improve in the creation of opportunities in workforce development, reducing right migration, low wage and non-competitive workforce. We get this from the for the Agency of Development of the United States. I forgot the name in English, but even this was when Trump was president. So we don't see a change in the way we address migration in the developed world, even if there is the different administrations. In addition, the NAFTA, one of the expected results of trade and growth is that NAFTA will reduce migration. And in this big agreement, paradoxically, there is no free labor mobility. This taken into account. There is so evidence that try to understand what is the relationship between growth and migration. What we expect is that if a country is still growing, migration will be reduced. However, Clemens and Postel find there is a inverted U shape. It means that when a country is growing, migration increase and then reduce. And onto the country get the benchmark of $500 to $10,000, immigration tend to decrease. According to this estimation, migration will decrease until 200 years. Yeah. So,
what is my main hypothesis? Is that at least what I have found and what I could believe is I don't find answers in the Main Street approach. So I find some answers in the heterodox approach. And Myrdal has this book about underdevelopment and development to try to understand which is the gap between developed and underdeveloping countries. And he talked about the backwash effects. The backwash effects is that you would expect that the flows of labor, capital, and trade will favor the developing countries. The lack of capital will go for the developing world to the developing world. Due to the scarcity, according to the mainstream, this will increase investment, increase growth, etc. What Myrdal thinks is not, it's completely the opposite. And what we found is that capital has a reverse causation. It goes from the developing world to the developing world, migration also, and trade usually make the things worse than improve it. And indeed, due to this trade imbalance, and particularly through technology, there is a decentralization process and a rapid tertiarization in the underdeveloped world. In addition, this industrialization can go beyond, according to the Banach-Painat effect. It goes to de-agriculturation, depopulation. So we experience like a dependency not only in sending people, but we see like the theory doesn't apply. What is the way to understand the underdeveloped in these migrations countries? What I believe that if you have a constant also imbalance in trade, in capital outflows, in a constant inflow, but only from remittances, it has nothing behind that. This doesn't have any production behind in the developed, underdeveloped world. You got a Dutch DC. If you got a Dutch DC, what you got? A constant tertiarization and a rate force of jobless growth. Well, one of my goals, the main goal is to understand these development patterns in countries that experience a large constant flow of migrants in the last 30 years. In particular, understand their economic structure, capital flow, real exchange rate, balance of payment, and not today, but in the future, inequality. Check if they have some Dutch disease, check how these Dutch disease are premature or not. If in trying to understand if they got into this backwash trap. According to the bibliography review, I just only found 2 papers who tried to approach the Gordon-Myrdal understanding theory, and they use this idea, Hall and Lewin, trying to understand if after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I don't remember how to say, Berlin Wall, yeah, both areas should be converted to in growth, but what they found, there is no any market mechanism which allow that. It is through institutional change that allow a better distribution between these regions. And yeah, and the other paper is more about how you could negotiate international agreement using the backwash effects of Gordon-Myrdal. Well, what I found also that is we have a negative net transfers from the developing world to the developing world, and this be the constant story since the 20s. I have to find these 2 papers. And about Dutch disease, there is a few. There is evidence that El Salvador, for example, has experienced a Dutch disease problem, and Kyrgyzstan, Dagestan also, and to conclude that middle-income countries are more prone to Dutch disease. Gabriel Palma, who find that using approach, which is the benchmark which a country should start to tertiarize and disindustrialize, he found that American country disindustrialized too quickly, probably because the Dutch disease in the boom commodities, and also because the Washington Consensus. And that's it. Yeah, I have a bunch of stuff, but I still have to figure out which methodology to use and how to approach. And there is data about it. Yeah, that's it. Any question? Welcome.
Julius was in a slightly different state regression than the rest of the people. Because he came in at
Can I say something?
Yes.
It would be great to use this tab, I don't know, a box or something, the effect of the research during the pandemic. A lot of people are looking at that, and I know that we were offline.
Yes.
There's always, because of all the informal, what they call informal, people that lost their jobs from the home farm started from. And it's funny because many colleagues at Colegio Mexico have always thought that remittances are not that important for poverty resolution, but I think the pandemic might have changed the policy. So that may I suggest that we want to look for maybe that is in my opinion, a very local contribution to what
Yes. What just the only thing that I found is like in El Salvador at least remittances passed from 20% to 25%, and remittances increased not only in relative terms with GDP but also in absolute terms. We have historical remittances amount right now in El Salvador, and it's not because well, a lot of people have migrated, but especially I believe that the main reason could be the people who are sending more money. So maybe they're working more, they're sacrificing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
At least in Mexico, they have reached unbelievable amounts, which I think also shows you that the aptitude of our government to look after the people.
Yes.
So we should not celebrate that.
No.
We should just point out that the efficiency of government, the state to look after their people.
Thank you.
I have a lot of relations with immigrants, especially Black American workers. There's a moral component. It's considered a high moral responsibility as part of that labor force. So part of the increase in the pandemic would be a sense of obligation. On the other side, some of that money is stimulus money. Right? Some of that increase would be the increase in cash liquidity among, not so much the most impoverished layers, but a lot of lower middle class, small business owners, things like that, receive that cash. Sitting at home to help out. Is there any, you probably don't know yet, but you just so, is there any pattern, interesting to know the pattern relationship between exported population and export of goods and trade balance? The countries that are sending population out, are they net exporters or are
they are net importers usually?
they're net importers?
Yeah.
Hardly.
Yeah. Yeah. And what allows remittances is to close the balance trade.
Sure, makes sense. You're sending people, they're sending money, and
Yes.
money's going back to
Yeah. I take into account the moral aspect. I believe that we should allow that this country not only have the right to migrate, also the right to not migrate. In that way, we have to change the economic structure of these countries.
Okay, thank you, Julius. I think that concludes the presentation.
I mean, the government is supposed to be still.
before we break for the lunch, I just have to say, having gone through the there have been countries where use order policy of worker exports in order to generate increased capital value, in particular Korea, Philippines, certain extent, okay? And these are formal programs. So basically what you're talking about here are like non-formal, non-governmental, private individual programs. Some of these export programs have been particularly successful.
You're talking about like contract workers.
Yeah.
A lot of Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. What happens was when, for example, the Korean worker goes back, the Korean worker goes back at the end of the contract, and part of the remittance had been set aside and was then given to the worker to use this as the possibility for the investments. So we have to be a little bit careful these sorts of programs. Because, if you get up in the second committee of the UN, tell a story about remittances instantly, but people don't understand. No, not exactly that. Effective programs that work. But the point is, the programs have to be targeted, and they have to be monitored and controlled, so the remittances, the use of the remittances are in fact not used for, say, not productive reasons, but support of people coming back. This is your point about being able to come back. Most of these programs and this contract programs then require that the workers do return. The workers who live in Saudi Arabia go back to the village, and then have the benefits.
Although Salvadoran laborers in the United States probably have greater labor rights than a lot of contract laborers in the programs with better structure.
That's probably true.
Labor rights are very
all I'm saying
heavily
is that we have to go
One 5-year program of growth that you are talking about was a national program in Mexico and Canada to bring the secondary.
there are a whole number of provincial programs that are run by the provincial governments, not by the federal government. That are in fact set up to build schools, hospitals.
But I'm saying Latin America, the federal program.
That was a U.S. government program. Okay, thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope that you enroll. Thank you everyone in the Zoom. We hope to see you soon. Bye.